So for those of you who are not familiar with the King's Entrepreneurship Institute, we believe that everyone can be entrepreneurial, and that entrepreneurial people can help make the world a better place by solving problems to create a healthier, smarter, more equal and sustainable future. And our role is to help students, staff and alumni to develop the entrepreneurial mindset to achieve that future. So we can help you become more creative problem solvers, develop skills that will make you more employable and boost your career, come up with more disruptive and innovative ideas, which we will hear from Claire about a great example of that. And of course, to start and scale successful startups. So the festival is all about celebrating disruptive thinkers and innovative ideas in and around Kings. And in addition to our many amazing startup founders, there are academics, researchers and practitioners across our university who are challenging established norms to address some of the world's most pressing challenges. And when we think about this week with COP26 happening, we know there's some pretty big challenges we need to solve. So it's great that we have the festival kind of shining a light on some, important issues. Without further ado, let's have an intro for our amazing speaker, Claire Steeves, who is a clinical senior lecturer at King's. She's also a consultant geriatrician, I hope I've pronounced that right, at Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust, as well as the Deputy Director for Twins UK. She is leading the research team analysing your data on the ZOE COVID Study app. And the app is a non-for-profit initiative that was launched at the end of March 2020 to support vital COVID-19 research. The app was launched by ZOE, the health science company, with a scientific analysis provided by King's, and it's got over 4 million contributors globally, and it's the world's largest ongoing study of COVID-19, which is just amazing that has kind of come out of our university. And over to you, Claire, to tell us all about it and the journey that you've been on.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen and hope the technology isn't disruptive. Excellent. So that's me. You've already heard about me, and I'm going to tell you a bit about this incredible collaboration that we've had between academics and a health startup company, and how much this has really changed actually the way that we can do research, and probably is going to change how we can do things in the future as well. So if you think back to March 2020, which seems like an awful long time ago now, but we were all, weren't we, facing this sort of emerging problem that we could see was really affected China, and then it was affecting Italy. It was clearly coming to us. And in the beginning of March, I was seeing my first patients at a care home that I worked in who had COVID. And all of a sudden, we were trying to grapple with a very new disease. And ultimately, we were facing a lockdown. We knew it was going to come. Actually, our app launched the day before the lockdown. So we knew lockdown was going to come. People were really hunkering down, not going to visit healthcare professionals, not trying to burden the NHS. And remember, of course, testing wasn't available for COVID-19 at that point. And so it was a really data poor landscape. And we felt, there was a big sort of dilemma in my head. Should I drop all my academic work and just go and join my clinical colleagues to really sort of fight this disease? Or was there something that we could do as clinical epidemiologists that could really help and transform in a different way? And so Tim and I had a great discussion, I remember it vividly, about trying to use some kind of app-based symptom tracking in order to map how the disease was working across the UK. And within a few minutes, I was like, yeah, that's going to be great. We could do it like this. Let's talk to ZOE, who we were already working with. We sat down over 3 or 4 days. We'd created a template app that we'd prototyped, and we thought, well, let's launch that at least to our twins within our cohort. And then Tim and ZOE's CEO, Jonathan Wolfe, he was the person really that said, no, let's launch this so that everybody right now, let's push it ahead, because this is the time to really get this information on the whole of the population. And thanks to Tim's sort of really good media relations, of course, then there was this incredibly viral response to it. And ultimately that's because the population was really thirsty for answers to what was going on, what were the symptoms, how can I do something to help? I'm hunkered down, locked away, but this is a terrible catastrophe. We all need to do it. So I think it was that combination of my clinical insight, seeing patients and seeing staff that were affected, knowing intuitively from interactions with them what the symptoms might be, mapping that out, using my experience in doing sort of other epidemiological studies, and thinking about how we could work with geography, because I've been working on some other health outcomes that were across geographical space in the UK. And then that link with ZOE, the non-for-profit, the health science company, for this non-for-profit exercise, meant that we could really develop that technology really rapidly and spread it quickly. Obviously, we've sort of said this, haven't I? You know, that there was no widespread point of care testing at that time. But actually, interestingly, at the same time that we were doing the app, I was rushing around using point of care testing. And we published actually in that first month one of the first point of care testing trials, which now of course is readily available. But we were one of the first clinical studies to actually put one of those into the ground as well at this time point. So it was jolly busy. But the other things that we were really wanting to understand is, how is the disease spreading geographically across the UK? And how does the disease present in different groups? Because we could already see that clinically, that actually some people seem to have developed very different disease. What was that? What were the different disease courses? And how could we use this to look after the people better? Here we go. This is the app. If you haven't seen it, this is kind of what it looks like. And the whole idea about the interface was, we wanted to make it absolutely as easy as possible for people to use. So that was one of the reasons, I think, why it was able to spread really quickly. People sort of saw the utility of it and the ease of it really easily. And this is what it sort of entailed, putting in an initial profile of your demographics, importantly your location, and information about whether what occupation you were, and then this daily log, where people put in, this is how I'm feeling fine today, or I'm not feeling quite right, these are my symptoms. And that we could use to create a trace and a track over time, a time series of symptoms, which is really useful for some of the research I'll show you. And then since then, we've been adding things like vaccinations, test results, doing collaboration with Department of Health to really get people with new symptoms to get a test, even if they're not one of the 3 core symptoms, and doing other surveys as well on the way. But I'll tell you a bit more about some of the developments that we've done throughout. And you will know about some of the impacts, but before really our data really showed it very consistently. Loss of sense of taste and smell, well, people sort of knew about it, but it wasn't in the guidance, it wasn't a reason to get a test. Whereas we were the first sort of team of people that really gave large-scale data to really show that this was a very key discriminatory symptom. But we also showed other things which led to sort of changes in guidance. For example, identifying that a new acute confusional state was something that could be the only presenting symptom in older adults. And so through sort of like this and many other sort of sets of work, we've produced sort of landmark papers on quite a number of issues, including this one here, which Carol Soudre led, which was around long COVID. And while right at the beginning, this disruptive technology didn't actually sort of get the government backup that we were really hoping that it might after the first week. Now we're having regular interactions with the Cabinet Office, the CMO, CSO. We're regularly talking to PHE and Twins UK, from which this is sort of arisen from, is a vanguard of the national core studies that were set up by Patrick Vallance. And we've been contributing to sort of a lot of core research that's been going on across the whole of sort of population science within the UK. So whilst it was sort of too disruptive at the beginning, and like, you know, an app, how could you possibly do science with that? And it's all, you know, going to be difficult to make real conclusive comments from. Sort of, we've become part of a trusted source, actually, of really good data that doesn't necessarily rely on massive government infrastructural funding. Although we are now funded by the Department of Health for some of our work. So here's this predictive score. So this is just a little bit of background for any of you who are interested. It's just like, how do we get to sort of looking for hotspots and that sort of thing? Well, ultimately, it was all about these symptoms, which we found to be highly predictive of COVID positivity. So by looking at the symptoms that people who had a positive test had compared to people who had a negative test, we were able to see this really dramatic sensitivity of loss of sense of smell, and created a sort of a logistic regression model, which we then used to develop a prevalence and then an incidence model of COVID-19. And this is how we then used it, which you may remember if you're an early user. This is one of our first sort of graphs of how the pandemic sort of spread across the country in the first wave. And at this time, we were really interested in whether or not we could use this technology to pick out hotspots. And indeed, we sort of finalized that. And we're one of the first to pick up the hotspot in Leicester, if you remember, back at the beginning of, well, this sort of like end of the first wave of the pandemic. And also, importantly, we were able, because we can map against the sort of indexes of social deprivation in the area that a person lives, we were able to identify that actually there were real hotspots of infection in areas that were more deprived. And we beat the ONS in sort of really identifying that as a problem. I'm not sure that we've done enough, actually, in terms of pushing that as a message, because obviously that's a major inequality. You know, COVID did show up major inequalities, didn't it, in our system? So here, going to sort of individuals, we were able to use this sort of this tracking of symptoms in an individual over time. We were able to use it to see how, actually, if we use machine learning models, we could see that there are different courses of disease in different individuals, and they related to the severity of the disease, after the first week or two. So what's interesting with COVID is that the average time before someone actually ends up being in hospital is about day 10, day 13 of their illness. So, we were thinking, well, actually, could we then use the first sort of few days of illness to actually predict who's going to then go on to get really sick? Because if we could do that, then we could really get people in to sort of monitor those patients and see how they were doing. And so this was sort of the background of this bit of research, where we were interested in looking at what were the symptoms that then predicted future development. And really, it was the number of symptoms actually in the first week of illness. So here you've got 6 clusters. There were 6 different types of illness that we saw. The top graph kind of picks out the symptoms in red, which differentiate the clusters. So you can see, for example, that cluster 3 has diarrhea as a very strong symptom. So that's a sort of a gastrointestinal form of COVID. But cluster 6, which is the 5 and 6, which were the ones that were most related to subsequent need for hospitalization, people had a lot of symptoms. So more than 5 symptoms in that first 5 days was a really strong predictor. And we were able to share this with GPs nationally and put this into the sort of planning around the virtual wards, which were being set up as we were preparing for the second wave. So a little bit about long COVID. I mean, I've already mentioned that we were one of the first to sort of describe the population prevalence of long COVID and what the symptoms were like. But again, the thing that I think might be particularly sort of disruptive or really change things, how we can really quickly in a new disease work out who might be going on to get long COVID after the first week of illness. And so using sort of machine learning models from all of these data, we could see that actually that you only needed 3 items. So that's your sex, your age, and the number of symptoms, again, that you had in the first week to provide a really good predictive model for who might go on to get long COVID. So the idea there was that that could be used potentially to identify people who could be part of prevention strategies or early intervention trials. But actually, the good news is that we've also been one of the first to show that probably long COVID is going to be less of an issue in the future, thankfully, because vaccination reduces the risk of long COVID by half, but it reduces it by half if you get COVID in the event of being vaccinated. But of course, your risk of getting COVID overall is massively reduced by being vaccinated. So overall, those things added together, long COVID, thankfully, will probably be less of a massive issue than it was last year. So just a little bit about hospitalizations and hotspot predictions. Just wanted to share you this. This is data from today, which is something that we're going to be putting out in the next week or so, which is around hospitalization and the prediction of future hospitalization. And I've just put up here the Midlands because this is one of the areas which is looking like the hospitalizations are rising. They're not rising exponentially, but they are rising right now. And we're just coming out of half term, and potentially the sort of increase in the school age population does trickle through then to older adults later, and we may see this going up. In other areas, like in London, it's a pretty flat line at the moment, but it is still quite high. But this is really important because ultimately, as we go into the winter, we might be coming to points where this is really actually critical for the NHS again. And so that's why we're wanting to bring out this hospitalisation prediction. And we can do this using test data in the UK actually very accurately. So you don't need the ZOE app. But the interesting thing is that, you know, if you just use the ZOE app, no testing data at all, and you're in a country, for example, lower or middle income countries that don't have access to mass testing, then you could use something like an app and be pretty accurate about working out how a pandemic is going to spread. So it's just reiterating the issue about Midlands, that it's Wales and the Midlands. The Midlands is below, but which are going up and still are identified as our hotspots now. So how has it been disruptive? I don't really, it's interesting. I like to think of myself as a creative person, and disruptive, it sort of like means not so creative. So in a way, what I think happened here is that, you know, this kind of new way of doing stuff erupted out of a sort of background of the way we used to do science, which was pretty slow. We thought of studies very hard before we did them. We then did them very slowly. We then, at the very end, when we've done all our analysis and everything, we're absolutely ready to publish. Then we talk to our participants and disseminate the data. And then we may be lucky and we might be able to catch an eye of somebody who's a policymaker. But what's happened here is that we've gone right into people's lives. We've been feeding back to them literally on a real-time basis of insights that we're getting straight away. We've been much less shy of producing insights as quickly as we can, sharing them with the public, because obviously there's been a massive need. And I think that's really revolutionized the way that actually we engage with our research participants. And that's been so important in actually continuing the activity of people with the ZOE app, why we've still got a really large number of individuals still reporting on a regular basis. But also it's been really disruptive and fantastic for the researchers, partly because of COVID and online working. We've been really collaborating across groups with people that we never did before. We've been collaborating much more aggressively, well, not aggressively, but more intimately with for example, a health science company, ZOE. It's also been disruptive, though, for other scientists who initially would be like, well, your app can't produce any good science because it's all a non-generalized population. It's just volunteers who must be very different from everybody. But actually, using careful statistical techniques, we've managed to make sure that we take account of those biases and we can produce really robust findings. And nobody has yet found a peer-reviewed published sort of finding that we've had that is then refuted later. So I think it's been quite a challenge for other scientists actually to see how this kind of thing can be useful if you do it well and fast. But also, yeah, so it's been a bit disruptive for government and other policymakers. I think at the beginning, this app that suddenly came out for King's College London, how could that be something that the government could take on? But actually now, as I say, that people have really are willing to listen to what ZOE has to say, and we're feeding through to right at the top end of policy making and thinking about the pandemic. Of course, we're only one of a landscape of studies that people are listening to, and of course there are a whole range of agendas that government have to think about as well. But there's a lot behind this, isn't there, in terms of the people and the team and the structure of what goes on. And really, there's a lot of modelling, data analysis, there's a lot of data cleaning and extraction. So there's been specific software development, both on the ZOE side and also on the King's side, to handle these absolutely mammoth quantities of data, actually, which has been an amazing team of people that we have. But then also on the public dissemination side, we've had this incredible relationship with the PR team at ZOE, who are incredibly good at getting messages out to people. And that's something that in academia, we're certainly not as good at, and that collaboration is really important. But also it's had a step change in the way that King's itself as well has been able to interact with the media and government bodies and websites and so on. So the public dissemination has been really very important. So the other thing that where it's sort of really transformative, really, this science, is how it's been a growing thing, it's been a modifying thing all the time. And often that's not the case when you set up a classic research study. You sort of like lay out your plan and then it's set in stone and you try not to alter it because then you think it might be corrupted in some way. Whereas, of course, with a pandemic and evolving situation, we've had to change with the times. And I think that's been really challenging, but it's also been really interesting because we can ask new questions all the time. So the future. So, I mean, we're thinking about this, in the long term, because ultimately, right back at March, when we were all locked down and there was no way that we could tell anyone about what we were experiencing if we had COVID other than go on the app. In the same way, there is a problem at the moment of access to primary care. There are issues with this sort of primary care availability, but also sometimes the illnesses that actually matter to people and cause sort of a lot of morbidity and not the things that GPs listen to or are interested in. And actually, can we use this as a sort of new kind of pocket doctor to understand that a little bit better, to really see whether or not we can understand how symptoms evolve over time, gain population insights much beyond the pandemic, and also play a role in feeding that back to individuals that are part of this great exercise to help with self-diagnosis and identification of when things are different from normal. And 650,000 participants have reconsented for studies on non-COVID illness, including the particular priorities that they've identified that they would like us to focus on: cardiovascular disease, dementia, it being part of their top priorities, as well as cancer. So I'm going to end there and see whether anyone wants any questions. But obviously, it's I'm just a spokesperson here from a fantastic team, in particular team at ZOE, but also our team at the biomedical engineering with Seb Orsalan, who's been leading all of the King's side data analysis, as well as the clinicians Tim Spector, Emma Duncan, and other teams in our Department of Twin Research. And, thanks again to the Department of Health and Social Care and Chronic Disease Research Foundation and our other funders who've been amazing at supporting us.
Amazing. So, thanks, Claire. I learned so much from that, and I thought I knew a lot about about the app. So that was amazing. I loved what you said around, really transforming the way people, users are kind of able to participate and interact with researchers, because I definitely felt like, I was doing my bit by, going on every day and, putting something in, and I really felt that as a participant. So great talk there. I've got a couple of questions but if those dialing in, listening in, would like to ask a question, what would help is if you could write your question in the chat, and then I will know to come to you. And if you want to ask it live, you can, or I can ask it on your behalf. So do put your questions in the chat. So kind of my first question, Claire, I guess you kind of have mentioned how, you know, in the beginning, maybe the government wasn't kind of paying a huge amount of attention, and now you're kind of like tuned into all the kind of key ministers and policymakers. How did you kind of make what you were finding compelling to the government, and kind of how do you tackle things when they also don't listen? Because I guess an example I was aware of is that you've done some great research around the top symptoms and how that changes depending on, you know, if you've been vaccinated once or twice and that kind of thing. And they didn't kind of update the guidance to the public around kind of this nuance around vaccination and symptoms. So yeah, what have been your tactics to compel the government to listen to you?
Well, I mean, one of the thing is, you know, continuing to engage in the media, and Tim's very good at continuing to keep that conversation going. And I think that's been really essential. But the second thing is, really, it wasn't until we had a peer review publication in a really high impact journal that could say this is bona fide stuff, that people were able to say, actually, you know what, this must be good because it's published in Nature Medicine and Science. And I think that was really helpful. So that and we did that pretty quickly. We got a paper out within a month. And that was when there was suddenly a turning point and people started sitting and listening. And I think ultimately that was because they needed some reassurance from the scientific community that this was worth listening to. But it's interesting about the issue of the symptoms changing. And actually, right from the start, we've been kind of a bit concerned that some of the key symptoms that might be the only symptoms that present might, you know, go unnoticed, or people don't test for them. And that's because the testing wasn't mandated for those things. And we've been in discussions with government and Public Health England for absolutely ages, as have other studies as well, who show the same thing. And ultimately, those three core symptoms are still probably the best three. You know, you could add fatigue and headache to them, but if you do that and you mandate testing and you mandate people to be isolated whilst they're waiting for the result to come back, then you actually would be testing, you'd be making that happen to a lot more people, because those specific symptoms are not as specific to COVID. And so that's been the balance that Public Health England have had. But where I'm a little bit disappointed is that now, of course, lateral flow tests are so very prevalent. I don't think we're doing enough to really drill home to people that if they are looking after someone who's frail, or if they are going out to a big party or event or whatever, they really should be doing a lateral flow test at least beforehand, because these are freely available, to make sure they're not inadvertently passing on even asymptomatic infection, which of course is much more common in people who've been vaccinated. So yeah, I think we could do more with that messaging, and that would then bring down these numbers, because we are seeing really quite hot pandemic still, where we shouldn't be, and we could be doing more to bring the numbers down.
Amazing. So I guess it's kind of, you know, if you're trying to convince a stakeholder to do something, it's kind of thinking about what would reassure them. And in your situation, it was that kind of scientific kind of endorsement that, you know, this is something you should pay attention to. Amazing. So you kind of touched on, you know, the future and how you're going to kind of look at other diseases, and I really love the idea of kind of empowering patients to kind of track symptoms so that they can have better kind of conversations with GPs. I think that's kind of, you know, it's quite hard when it goes to GP to try and convince them that there's something going on, and they often don't believe you. So that would be a super tool to have. I guess I'm curious about, yeah, how you kind of see kind of user numbers and user engagement possibly fading as people perceive, COVID also to be fading, and kind of how you're going to sustain kind of, your 4 million, people posting kind of however often they do, as you kind of transition into this broader kind of remit around, health and other diseases.
Yes, absolutely. And we've got a lot of energy going on at the moment in trying to sort of bring these things into the app. We've got to balance this against the needs of our funders to be making sure that we are still focusing on COVID, and yet we know that sort of that's not going to be forever, and so we need to be doing these things both at the same time. But I think ultimately the first thing is going to be to make sure that we are giving something back to users, and giving something back to people so that they maybe have some kind of feedback on what they've been logging, and their pathway, and so they can see the utility to them of continuing to log. And I think that's where sort of like this diary, this feedback idea is really important. And so I really hope that's going to be something that we can do as quickly as possible. But also, actually, the people that are still on the app are really engaged in trying to answer these big questions around cardiovascular disease, dementia, etc. And so we're going to be doing a series of studies and games and things like that to bring into the app that are around those areas, and trying to get sort of accelerated research outputs back to participants as soon as we can from anything that we do introduce, to keep that energy going and keep people's interest.
I guess as well, this isn't a question that I've put in the list I shared beforehand, but like if you're kind of going to start engaging kind of with people in primary care, GPs for example, do you imagine that you need to do some work with them to kind of take this seriously in the same way that you've kind of been on that journey with the government and the kind of health bodies in the UK?
That's right, and it's currently a sort of a bit of a debate of ours as to which way to go first with this. But certainly we've got within King's, actually we've got some great links, especially locally within Southwark and Lambeth, with GP network of really interested, engaged GPs. And so one of the first things, if we decide to go in that direction, is to really engage with those groups, to try and make sure that whatever we produce is going to be working for that stakeholder, because ultimately it's going to be really important if it does end up being a pocket doctor, that it's useful to the real doctor that's then managing that patient.
Amazing. I've noticed Sarah's got a hand up. Sarah, did you have a kind of direct question from what we?
Yeah, I mean, I find it easier to say it than to spend ages typing it up. Hi, Claire, how are you? That's not the question. I wanted to know, so this whole festival has kind of been an exercise in public engagement, and I've been to a lot of talks about where different scientists and people working in kind of specialist fields are talking about their different kind of public engagement exercises. So the TikTokification of science, using Instagram and social media to talk about science. Someone today using popular culture to talk about cybersecurity. And I'm interested, I love how much public engagement the ZOE app has done, and the way that they have created lots of webinars and really kind of kept their audience engaged. Has this changed the way you think about science and the public and that relationship? And what kind of ideas or disruptive ideas for public engagement can you see going forward?
Yeah, I think it's definitely changed things, and it's a big challenge, because it means that actually there's a much greater time sort of urgency to get things back, because ultimately participants want to have feedback as soon as possible. So and that's great in the context of a pandemic, because everything needs that, doesn't it? What's going to be interesting is whether we can sustain that going forwards. But so in terms of disruptive, I mean, I think one of the real challenges that I can see, and I'm not sure whether I've got the disruptive edge yet, but maybe if any of you have a great idea, then do come to us. But one of the things that's going to be really important is actually making this doable and attractive to somebody who's under sort of greater stress. Maybe I'm thinking about somebody who's living in a very busy block of flats, dealing with 3 kids and a mother who's ill, and dealing with sort of issues around income insecurity, that kind of thing. How can we make sure that this works for that person? Because ultimately that person is probably much more at risk of worse health outcomes than somebody who's much more well-to-do. And so I think that the real challenge is going to be to make sure that we engage as much of a diverse community as we can, to make sure that we keep being generalizable to, and most importantly, generalizable to the populations that are most at risk of health outcomes.
It strikes me from Sarah's question as well, it's like a whole different skill set that researchers and scientists might need to have if to sustain this. It's kind of like, you're not going to be kind of on your own in a lab working away for hours, kind of not talking to anyone. This is actually kind of thinking about, how to talk to other people, and you were kind of saying that's quite challenging maybe to kind of other scientists. Do you think there's some work there to kind of support researchers and people working in this field to do more of this disruptive kind of work and science?
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about working with within the commercial sector, because of course commercial sector are really very good at doing this. Yeah, people who are selling things are really very good at getting an audience. That's where we need to sort of be learning from other methods, but also we need to be using sort of smart technologies, don't we, to be able to collect data in ways which are as least disruptive to participants, with their consent. Of course, the governance is so important, so that actually this huge amount of data that's circulating is used not just for sort of commercial gain and sort of people to sell things, but ultimately to improve public health.
So I guess in thinking about how your team kind of come up with the next disruptive idea or feature or question that you want to ask, what kind of process do you go through to kind of decide what direction you go in as a team?
Yeah, so actually we just had a really big brainstorming meeting today, where principally we were going around the table trying to think about long-term and then short-term aims, opportunities, and sort of in a sense brainstorming a little bit like you might do in any sort of situation, and ultimately then it's a question of coalescing onto something that seems to be workable and also feasible. But I think that the other thing is, when I showed that picture of an erupting volcano, because in a sense I feel it's a bit like that. That's what this process is a bit like. It's also a bit like the seed suddenly germinating because suddenly it's been supplied with new water or new energy or something like that. And I think what the pandemic is this moment really in history when suddenly we were all stressed by a particular thing which was disrupting us very massively, and we had a real fertile ground there for developing new ideas. And what we need to do is see how we can use lots of the different things that we've learned over the last 2 years to make sure that we can sustain changes in the way we do science and live.
Amazing. And my kind of final question, and hopefully we can hand over to some other voices, is just around kind of what you mentioned to do with COVID and exposing the kind of health inequalities that exist here and around the world. And you kind of suggested that there's possibly more that the app and the kind of research can do there. So I'm just kind of wondering what you'd love to see happen, or how you might be able to leverage the kind of data further to kind of enable, I guess, the system to kind of start to address these inequalities, as opposed to just be like, oh, they're there, we just have to accept they're there kind of thing. How could you disrupt this kind of space in the future?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things actually that we see, not in this context, but we've done some other work we're looking at what are the factors that drive, for example, people's inability to get to an appointment with the doctor, and so not turning up to see a doctor. And the things that are the biggest drivers are these socioeconomic drivers. And I think that's because life is actually very complex and difficult for some people to be able to access care, and access care in a timely way and know about it and be able to do it. Whereas there are other sectors that may be more educated and so on, who actually find it quite easy to access the care that they need and get what they need. And I think that's maybe what drives health inequalities significantly. But I think the thing about mobile phone technology is that it actually is very disseminated across lots of sectors. Actually, there are very few people that don't have some kind of access now to a phone. I mean, there are people, obviously, but actually it is quite well disseminated. And so if we can use that as a way of making it easier for people to talk to healthcare professionals, to get supply and help that they need, then that's going to be really, really revolutionary, and could be a new sort of like way of approaching primary care in this country. And so I think that's what I'd like to see going forward.
Amazing. And also, like, language barriers, I guess, is kind of, having worked in the NHS previously, I know that's also kind of an element. I guess with the app, you've got the kind of, I imagine, ability to translate it into different languages and people to select that, and then kind of, I don't know, help people with actually the actual conversation if English is not their first language as well.
Absolutely.
Amazing. So I'd like to kind of hand over to those who are with us. If anyone would like to ask Claire a question, you can either raise your hand and unmute yourself, or if you would like to put it in the chat, I can also read it out. I wonder, Kat, you're writing a blog. Is there something we've not covered that you really need the answer to for your blog?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot now. So I'm actually one of the people, me and my company work really closely with the ZOE PR team. So I've interviewed Claire many times over the past year, being responsible for writing a lot of the blogs that have turned up in the app and on the ZOE website. And actually, it has just been incredible to see how quickly academic scientists can work when yeah, I'm an ex-scientist myself, and it's just been incredible to see how quickly everyone's really pulled together to do this kind of research. And it the word I like to use is like digital epidemiology. I think this has changed the way we're going to do epidemiology now. We're not going to have paper forms and all this kind of stuff. We can recruit large cohorts of people and engage them in science. I think is absolutely fantastic. And I think if there's a positive out of the pandemic, it has shown people that science is here, it's right here, and we can actually do stuff about it. And I think all credit to Claire and the team for recognizing that and jumping on it and being flexible, because there's been a lot of stuff's happened and a lot of stuff's changed as we've gone through it. I was wondering, Claire, actually, then a nice question, like, is there a particular moment that has really stuck with you? I remember interviewing you about the findings on delirium and realizing like this could really change something, but like, is there one particular thing that stands out to you?
Well, interesting. I do think I remember this specific time when it was about, I think it was about in May time, when I was thinking, as a geriatrician, I'm thinking about the multi-system disorders all the time, and that's one of the good things, in a sense, of being a geriatrician and working with the app, is that I wasn't just thinking about one single system of respiratory system. I'm thinking of everything. But once we sort of really saw the breadth of symptoms that were coming out, and we started to see the tail of long COVID, then suddenly that sort of like penny dropped, that actually we could be dealing with something that's a bit like dengue fever or syphilis or something like that, that's going to come back and maybe could reactivate, or could this sequester somewhere. So say, for example, in syphilis or so on, the infective agent sort of stays hidden in the body for some time. And we still don't know actually whether that might be the case in some people with long COVID. I think it might be in some, because there is some evidence that the COVID virus can remain in certain tissues. But actually, probably for the majority of people with long COVID, it's more a prolonged recovery from scarring from the illness, and also sort of like the massive social and psychological stress of this really difficult illness that people have had in the context of a pandemic. So yeah, but I think it's that point when I thought, gosh, you know, this is not just something that's going to come and go. This is something that might be with us for a long time. And this is something that might actually mark the population for a whole time. And then once I was sort of thinking about that, then I'm thinking about, actually, you know, what about all the people, all the children that are born in the pandemic? What about all those babies? What happens? You know, and so, you know, one of the studies that we're doing off the back of this is a study about pregnancy and people and children who are born in the pandemic, what it's been like for them, and potentially what it's like for them in the future. And likewise, you know, all those other potential knock-ons of the pandemic in terms of the social changes. So suddenly I sort of had this realization in about May. I remember exactly where I was, and I was suddenly thinking, whoa, this is something that's going to last for a lifetime for us, I think.
Amazing. So Pablo, I see you're typing in the chat. I don't know whether it's easier for you to ask a question live. It's just come through. Okay. Hi, I'm working on mucormycosis. I don't know if I've said that right. And Miss C calculator, and I'm from India. Is there a platform where we can collaborate, sharing app and clinical trial ground of, I think it's with each other? Does that make sense as a question, Claire? As a non-scientist, yes, I'm not sure it does to me.
Well, very interesting. Yeah, well, we're very keen. I mean, we have shared our data dictionary right from the start with any scientist who's interested to collaborate. And in fact, the data from the app is also shared with HDR UK for for researchers within the UK to use. It's a bit more difficult for it to be sent sort of like worldwide, but of course the data frame, as in the sort of the data dictionary and the structure of the app, is something that we're very happy to share, because ultimately, if it can be used for another purpose, or to study another disease or in another country, that'd be highly useful.
Amazing. Any other questions from the floor? Anyone wants to come off, put the hand up, come off mute? Says thanks for the reply. Great. While people are still thinking, I guess another question that comes to mind, Claire, is kind of, you know, if you're someone studying at King's at the moment and you're like, I want to be a disruptive researcher scientist working in health tech, you know, what's your kind of recommendation for kind of how to set yourself up to be disruptive and to have the skills to kind of take on those kinds of challenges and do things differently?
I think the first thing to say is be brave. And the second thing to say is be persistent, because it's not easy. You take a lot of false starts, and there's a lot of sort of setbacks, you know, and it's not always fertile ground. And the third thing is find the right people to work with, because ultimately it's a team effort. Everything is a team effort, really. And if you can find the right sort of supporter, backers, people who are going to sort of help do the project with you, nobody can do this kind of disruptive stuff on their own. It takes a team. So build a team.
Build a team. What a great link to one of the 7 skills of an entrepreneurial mindset. Not sure if that was intentional, Claire, but I loved it. I guess, Claire, is there anything that you know, if we end this and you're like, oh, I really wish I'd said that, or I forgot to mention this, is there any kind of final word?
Well, I think I've waffled on enough. No, I don't have anything else particular to say, but just to encourage everybody to to keep persisting with any ideas they have, and if it's a good idea, don't take no for an answer, type of thing.
And of course, we are here at the Entrepreneurship Institute to help you to develop the kind of entrepreneurial mindset And of course, you don't have to have an idea as well. You can still get involved with us, even if you're not sure what you want to work on or don't have an idea. There's still lots of ways you can get involved and get yourself in a place where you're more likely to have that bright idea. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope it's been interesting. I've learned a huge amount. Claire, thank you for kind of sharing that in a really kind of accessible kind of way for I mean, me as a non-scientist, but there might be others in the audience. And I wish everyone a really great Thursday. I'm lost what day of the week it is. Thursday evening. Thanks everyone.
Nice to see you.